Believe it or not, the emblem that you see on the top of your screen is not an advertisement for some defunct local television station from the 1970s, but rather the actual campaign logo of Jay Inslee, one of the 2020 Democrats who was ultimately unsuccessful. In this video, I'd like to look at Jay Inslee's political career, which has been quite interesting, and also his failed run for president and his prospects. In this video, I will be revealing that Jay Inslee is in fact an establishment neoliberal, but that if we take him against other establishment neoliberals, he's clearly preferable to the vast majority of them. In fact, of all of the various establishment candidates, I think that he might be the cream of the crop, such as it is. That being said, let's take a look at his campaign, which I think, regardless of his original intentions, ended up being a campaign for a cabinet post. The oldest of three boys, Jay Inslee was born in 1951 in Seattle, Washington. He is a fifth-generation Washingtonian, which I'm sure is something that helped him immensely in his career in Washington politics. Inslee's parents were interesting people, and they did quite a bit to shape Inslee's early life. His mother was a clerk at Sears, so she was someone who had a relatively modest position in life, and his father, Frank Inslee, was a high school counselor and football coach. He was apparently quite good at his job, since he later worked as the athletic director for Seattle Public Schools, which is a pretty high position for a local football coach. In high school, Jay Inslee excelled both academically and in sports. He was a high school honor student and also an athlete who played both as a football player, I believe he was a quarterback, and he was a starting forward on his high school's basketball team. As a senior in 1969, Inslee was on the state championship basketball team, and that remains something that he treasures in his life. He recently put up a tweet about it for the 50-year anniversary of that momentous achievement. While Jay Inslee didn't come out of school looking to get involved in politics immediately, the seeds of his political activity were sown quite early. While he was a kid, his parents would organize groups of high schoolers to go up to Mount Rainier in order to help clean up the mountain and the surrounding area. So his lifelong love of protecting the environment is something that he inherited from his parents. In 1973, Jay Inslee graduated from the University of Washington with a Bachelor of the Arts in Economics. He then went on to law school at Willamette University College of Law and graduated with his JD in 1976. After graduating law school, Inslee moved to Selah, Washington with his new wife. They started a family there, and he worked for 10 years at a local law firm while also working part-time as a city prosecutor. And for those of you who live in this town of 7,000, I apologize if I mispronounce the name. Knowing my luck, someone will tell me that it's actually pronounced Sella or something like that, and that I totally fucked it up. Whatever. Inslee had a reputation as an aggressive courtroom presence, going after drunk drivers and domestic abusers, among other things. But he also had a more interesting path through the courts than that, as he ended up suing Yakima County on behalf of a farmer whose irrigation system was damaged by government workers at one point, and another time he ended up suing the state of Washington when someone fell over a guardrail that Inslee argued should have been higher. So, throughout his law career, throughout that 10 years or so that he worked in Selah, Washington, Inslee established himself as a lawyer who worked more or less for the people rather than, say, a corporate lawyer, someone like a Deval Patrick. In 1985, Inslee developed a taste for political life, however, when he advocated building a new high school, and he somehow was inspired by that experience to then try to seek public office at the state level. 3 years after advocating for a new high school in his local area, Jay Inslee decided to run for the state legislature. He was running as a progressive Democrat in a conservative rural district. We should probably put progressive Democrat in scare quotes here for a couple of reasons. The first being the typical use of labels in America, which is always slippery and never precise. Not to mention that in Washington state and local or state elections, they have a runoff system, and so he was not necessarily competing to become the Democratic nominee, but rather to finish first or second overall out of all the candidates and then go on to the general election. So what we'll see is that in some ways he positioned himself to the left of one of his major Democratic rivals, but also to that candidate's right. For the most part, you would think, given the conservative rural nature of the district, that this would heavily favor Republicans, but this seems to have been before the great sorting out of Democrats and Republicans into urban and rural areas. So keep this in mind if this seems a little odd to you at this juncture. Inslee's primary opponent during this race was a fellow Democrat and former Yakima mayor. She had name recognition and she was the leading Democrat in the race. So she would obviously be the person Inslee would need to get votes from in order to advance. Inslee was able to emphasize his work as a lawyer who fought for average people, and he was also able to emphasize what he had done on behalf of farmers. This district being mostly rural, that was a major constituency. You don't normally think of Washington state as having a lot of farmers, but this particular area did. At one point, the state of Washington announced that it had a budget surplus, and the candidates debated over how to use the money. Inslee called for a middle-class tax cut. His opponent said this would be reckless and irresponsible. Presumably she wanted to earmark the money for some other purpose, but Inslee said that a middle-class tax cut was called for. Now, this position of his could be progressive, as progressives typically do favor tax cuts for middle and lower income people. However, this also could have been in line with his later New Democrat philosophy, since this was something that Bill Clinton did once he had a budget surplus. Or actually, wait, that would be Bush using the Clinton surplus. I misspoke. One thing that he did that was certainly progressive and that put him to his opponent's left is that he accused her of favoring a sales tax. She denied this and said that this was an untrue attack. Sales taxes are inherently regressive, and this would give Jay Inslee a kind of flavor of economic populism that would appeal to both the left and the right. Most people do not like paying extra for the stuff they buy. He managed to survive the runoff, outperforming all of the Republican candidates and all of the other Democrats, and then he had a head-to-head with this Democrat who was the former Yakima mayor. He managed to win narrowly by maybe 3 or 4 points, and then he was able to advance in the state legislature. When he ran for re-election in 1990, he was re-elected easily, and it wasn't really much of a contest. That is one thing I've noticed about Jay Inslee, is that he struggles in early elections and barely squeaks by, but when he runs for re-election, he tends to do much better. So Inslee, despite not really looking or seeming like much of a politician, is actually quite good at winning over his constituents and gaining their loyalty. While he was in the state legislature, Inslee was primarily known for pushing to build 5 branch campuses of Washington State University. This bid was unsuccessful, and he also pushed for more energy-efficient state agencies, signing on with a bill that required them to become more energy efficient. Following his time in the Washington State Legislature, Jay Inslee decided to go national. In 1992, he was able to win a close primary and then a close general election in the 4th District of Washington, a district which heavily favored Republicans. So this was a pretty solid win for him. However, unfortunately for Jay Inslee, the next election cycle was 1994, the famous Republican wave led by Newt Gingrich and his contract with America. During the 1994 rematch, he faced the same Republican, and the Republican was able to ride the wave to victory. Later, Jay Inslee would comment that he thought that his vote for the federal assault weapons ban was what had cost him the election. Truth be told, however, even if he had voted against the assault weapons ban, he most likely still would have lost just because of the national trend and because of the sorting out of America that was going on at this time, where rural areas were becoming overwhelmingly Republican and urban areas were becoming more and more Democratic. This is something that has only intensified since the 90s. After his defeat and his departure from Congress, he moved to the Seattle suburbs and briefly took up practicing the law again. But then in 1996, he decided to enter the gubernatorial primary. Once again, this was an open primary for both parties, and he was not one of the top vote getters, so he was eliminated early. At that point, though, he had managed to attract the attention of President Bill Clinton, who hired him to be a regional director of Health and Human Services. In 1998, Jay Inslee ran for Congress, this time in the swing 1st District near Seattle. Unlike in 1994, where he had been mostly a victim of circumstance, this time Inslee would be the beneficiary of demographic changes that were going on, which benefited both himself and local Democratic candidates in general. Democrats have been making a lot of strides in the Seattle area, so things look good for Inslee. And he also showed some political savvy by being the first candidate to run ads hitting the GOP for pushing the Lewinsky scandal. Many Americans were weary of the scandal. They thought it was stupid, and it actually caused Bill Clinton's approval rating to tick up very slightly. If you're in an area which is becoming more Democratic, and that is the overall trend, that's where a lot of independents are at when it comes to the Lewinsky scandal, well, that is a great tactic to do, and Inslee effectively wrote it as a wedge issue, and this was something that helped him reach a 49-44 victory against the Republican in the race. His wins in 1998, 2000, and 2002 were somewhat close. I believe he won with 54% of the vote in 2000 and maybe 55% in 2002. So those are solid victories, but not exactly blowouts. But later on, after that point, the further bluing of the district and then some redistricting to make the district safer made all of his subsequent wins automatic. So most of the wins he had in the 1st district don't really speak to his electability one way or the other, although I think the initial one could perhaps say that Inslee had the pulse of Washington State pretty well down. Once in Congress, Inslee joined the New Democrat Coalition. This is the group of Democrats who effectively are the neoliberal wing of the party. This is the faction that Bill Clinton and Rahm Emanuel and people like that brought to prominence and that Barack Obama effectively sustained as president. While in Congress, Inslee became an expert on tech issues and a vocal advocate of fighting climate change. Neither of those things should come as any surprise. The reason why he'd be an expert on tech is because the Seattle area is the home to a lot of tech companies such as Amazon, which by this point was becoming a thing. And also when it comes to the climate issue, there are a lot of environmentalists in Washington State. Inslee had always been one of them, so it should come as no surprise that this remained a major priority for him. In Congress, however, Inslee did prove that he was a new Democrat in action as well as in word. He did not hesitate to raise money from pharmaceutical companies, healthcare companies, lawyers, which is not really a neoliberal commitment, and high-tech firms. Inslee, in other words, was strong on environmental issues, but ultimately was willing to play ball when it came to issues of healthcare, drug prices, and helping out tech companies trying to form monopolies or dodge regulations. If we look at the entire period of Inslee's run in Congress, he can safely be described as a reliable Democratic vote, meaning that if you look at where the majority of Democrats stood on any given issue, that's probably where you'd find Jay Inslee. The only thing that he did to distinguish himself really is that at one point he tried to push for investment in energy independence. This was around 2007. He wrote a book about the need for energy independence, and that ultimately kind of didn't go anywhere. Later on, he voted against CAFTA, but generally he is free trade. Even the conservative Cato Institute, which is very hard on Democrats when it comes to ranking their reliability on issues, gives them a 50% on trade issues. Cato's position is to be 100% free trade. So this means that while Inslee is certainly less free trade than some of his colleagues, he is not by any means a protectionist. So he has been outspoken against Trump's limited protectionism, and if he were to run in the general election, he would be hard-pressed to beat Trump on that issue in, say, the Midwest. That being said, he would do much, much better on the issue than a whole lot of candidates in the field, or Trump's 2016 opponent, Hillary Clinton. Inslee was also an outspoken critic of the 2003 Iraq War. This is something that a whole lot of Democrats didn't really have much to say about. And he also favored intervention in Libya in 2011. He went on the record as advocating for intervention. This proved to be a move that many people now consider a mistake, so let's call it a split on whether or not we should intervene. He called one right, one wrong. In 2009, one of Jay Inslee's proudest moments occurred when he was invited to the White House to play a game of pickup basketball with Barack Obama. The two of them seemed to be pretty good friends. In 2016, when Inslee was running for re-election, Obama showed up to help him raise money. Inslee was elected governor in 2012 and then re-elected in 2016. Let's take a brief look at his tenure as governor. It's mostly positive, actually. One of the things that kind of got headlines locally is that he had at least 3 protracted battles with the state legislature over the budget, and he had to call emergency sessions to get it passed. One of the budget battles, I believe, was the 2017 one, had them pass a 600-plus page budget that many of them had not had time to read. So there were some controversies, but nothing major enough to really break into the national consciousness. During his time as governor, Inslee has successfully raised the state minimum wage to $12 an hour. He passed a net neutrality bill in 2018. He imposed a moratorium on death penalty cases. The death penalty is still legal in Washington state, but he basically said that he's just not going to enforce it anymore. And while that seems like a relatively progressive position, the thing is he's leaving the death penalty as a wedge issue, which I think is one of the sort of calling cards of neoliberalism, leaving wedge issues in place so that they can be discussed and fought over in future years. Neoliberal candidates, for instance, would not want to put the abortion issue to bed, for instance, because they want to keep fighting over it year after year, so they don't have to talk about, say, economics. Now, I don't know for sure that this is what Inslee was thinking, but I do suspect that this was part of his thinking on this particular issue. One of his key achievements as governor is to pass a bill to eliminate fossil fuels from state electricity supply by 2045, thus becoming the 4th state to establish a mandate for carbon-free electricity. This was considered bold for the most part in the press, although many environmental activists in Washington state tried to sue Inslee's government because they said that he was basically instituting officially a fossil fuel driven economy in Washington state. It's a pretty slow timeline. It's certainly not fast enough to meet climate change projections, but it is better than nothing, so we can call that kind of a wash, I suppose. Although given how strongly he has spoken out about environmental issues and how he touts himself as an expert on environmental policy, the fact that the timeline is so slow is slightly embarrassing. Currently, Jay Inslee is embroiled in a battle to get a modest increase in the number of beds available in homeless shelters throughout Washington state. The state is growing population-wise, and this means the homeless population is growing. He is tapping into the state's rainy day fund to do this, and this is leading to some battles with the state legislature. One thing that he did that probably has helped some young people, but has also helped some major corporations who don't want to have to pay much to people who provide labor, is that he's created a paid apprenticeship program in the state, and this includes most of the large companies there: Boeing, Amazon, Kaiser Permanente, Microsoft, etc. So, while there are a few things that have negative sides to them, for the most part, Inslee has been a pretty good governor, and there's not all that much to criticize, at least nothing that would be, say, disqualifying if he were to actually run for president. For those of you who only started paying attention to the 2020 Democratic race, say in the fall of 2019 or later, you probably didn't realize that Jay Inslee actually had made a run for the presidency. Well, let's talk about what his strategy was and why it wasn't unreasonable, but it didn't pan out. Inslee's strategy, if we have to boil it down, was to campaign on his record as governor, advocate for climate change action in a way that set him apart from the field, and hope that the political climate would be favorable to someone like him. This is perfectly reasonable. There weren't too many other governors in the running. Some of the other ones, like Steve Bullock, were from smaller, more obscure states. And governors tend to be able to claim executive experience in ways that Congresspeople can't. However, in recent years, Democrats have tended to pick senators and Congresspeople who have much more experience with national issues and tend to have much more media presence when it comes to initial name recognition. However, when he's talking about maybe people will be looking for someone like him, it's not unreasonable to think that someone like a Jay Inslee might have been the preference of a large portion of the Democratic base. In 2016, not many people predicted that Bernie Sanders would gain as big of a following as he did, and also not many people predicted that Trump would win the Republican nomination and then win the White House. So you never know exactly what the political climate will be going in. Inslee was exactly correct, and it makes all the sense in the world that he put his name in the hat, because why not? It was possible people would be looking for a somewhat boring but reliable guy, someone with executive experience, someone who is temperamentally sound and stable. So, and also, if there was an environmental crisis, or if the Democratic base was more environmentally conscious, then perhaps Inslee would be able to ride that to success. He also pointed out in his case for why he has a chance that both Presidents Carter and Clinton emerged from the pack of primary contenders as obscure governors and went on to win the White House. So again, perfectly reasonable strategy, but it didn't work out. We'll get into more of the reasons later on. If I had to point to one major mistake that Inslee made when he was rolling out his campaign and then trying to sell himself in interviews, it would be this. Inslee was way too comfortable being the climate change guy, and he did nothing to avoid being labeled as a single issue candidate. The reason why this is a bad idea as a candidate is because most voters think of a single issue candidate as something of a novelty or a joke. Now, if they agree with you on the issue, they might back you, but not that many people are going to be willing to sign up for that. This is one of the problems that Andrew Yang has had. Yang has a whole plethora of issues, but he's only known for one of them, the UBI. And because of that, many people don't take him seriously as a contender, and they're not really willing to give him a shot. They think that he is someone who just says a problem and then says $1,000 a month is a solution. And if you look at his debate performances alone, it's hard not to see why people think that. So, Inslee has run a much, much less effective single-issue candidacy than Yang, and that was one of the main reasons why he is not in the race now. Given what we established about how Inslee is a fairly clever politician and he's always been quite adept at running for office, I think it's safe to say that he most likely knew that his strategy was flawed. It's perhaps possible that he was angling for a cabinet position or to just advocate for climate change action and had no actual interest in winning the presidency. So I will throw that out there as an option, but for the most part, when someone presents themselves as a presidential contender, I assume that they are quite serious about winning the office and that they're doing everything in their power to achieve victory. That being said, let's do a quick campaign autopsy. One opportunity that many of the lower tier candidates like Inslee had to break out from the pack was to perform well in the early debates. He didn't really have any standout or interesting moments in any of the debates, and he never polled well. Apparently his campaign stops in places like Iowa didn't really garner much attention, and people didn't really take to him very easily. He did do well in terms of getting a pretty solid number of individual donors to give him money, but if you look at all of the other metrics by which one might judge the health of a campaign, his campaign was fairly anemic and it wasn't really going anywhere. Climate change is a crucial issue, and it is a crucial issue, importantly, for Democratic primary voters. However, it doesn't seem to motivate people the same way that some other issues do. Issues of economic justice tend to be very motivational. But climate change just doesn't seem to carry a candidacy by itself. And I think that Jay Inslee's failure proves that to some extent. Of course, I'd be remiss if I failed to point out that in a crowded field, a certain number of candidates will simply be ignored. They will be dismissed early, either because they're single issue, whack jobs, or what have you, and no one will look at them again. If there was one thing that caused people to not look twice at Inslee, I think it has to be his fatal lack of charisma. Now, on the state level, perhaps he has a sufficient amount of charisma, but on a national level, as a presidential contender, he did not look very good next to a lot of the other people on stage. During one of the debates, he was positioned between Bill de Blasio and Tulsi Gabbard, and next to both of them, he looked out of place and awkward. He had a huge grin on his face at a few inappropriate moments, and he just simply didn't seem very poised or dignified. Tulsi Gabbard has a pretty dignified bearing, so it's hard to, I guess, look more presidential than she does. And when it comes to Bill de Blasio, even though a lot of people who know him know that he's a bit of a blowhard, during the debates he looked more composed, he was taller, and just kind of better looking than Jay Inslee, to put it bluntly. So you had two guys who kind of superficially looked and sounded alike in terms of where they stood, but Bill de Blasio was the bigger and superficially better version. If you don't have charisma, you can't really break out of the pack. And it doesn't have to be traditional Hollywood star charisma. It could even be curmudgeonly charisma like Bernie Sanders. But you have to have a distinctive personality that people relate to in some way, and Jay Inslee just doesn't have that. So he had no way to break out. After the first two debates, where he didn't really do much, he failed to qualify for the CNN Climate Town Hall, which was the event that he was most looking forward to, and he also failed to qualify for the third Democratic debate. Knowing that his candidacy had run its course, Jay Inslee wisely decided to drop out on August 21st, 2019. He said that he wasn't going to endorse any candidate in the primary, but that he would back anyone who won the nomination. He also expressed that he was confident that whoever the eventual nominee was would be a sufficient champion of climate change action. Another critique that I have of Inslee is that while he certainly understands the shaking out of America and the urban-rural divide as someone who cut his teeth politically in a rural area, he still can't quite navigate it. He still can't quite overcome it. Now, maybe he did to some extent in his own state, but he doesn't seem to have created a campaign platform which would appeal to, say, auto workers in the Midwest or potential swing voters in the South, say in the Sun Belt. Inslee doesn't really seem to know how to message very well on issues that aren't climate change. And I think that if he had somehow become the nominee, he would have really struggled to connect with common people. I think he would have tried, and I think that he maybe has a good enough voting record that he could make a case, but he just doesn't quite fit in outside of the sort of liberal bicoastal circles. So ironically, even though he got his start in rural Washington and he has succeeded there, I don't think that in today's political climate he really translates outside of a bubble that he only entered much later in life. But that's just my subjective take. I don't think he'll ever be anywhere close enough to the nomination for us to test this hypothesis one way or the other. So, what is Jay Inslee's ideological disposition, and what are his prospects when it comes to what he might get if a Democrat is elected in 2020 or even in 2024, since I don't think he'll be leaving the political scene by that point? Ideologically, I think it's quite clear, based on his affiliation with the New Democrats and his overall voting record, his political allies, etc., that he is an establishment neoliberal, albeit one on the left end of that particular spectrum. In that sense, he is somewhat comparable to Julian Castro, although the two of them are on the left of the neoliberal spectrum for different reasons. Frankly, Inslee's issues are superior to those of Castro. However, as one of the leftmost neoliberals, this means that Inslee is uniquely well positioned to take part in pretty much any Democratic administration. He's left enough to perhaps find common ground with a Warren or a Sanders, and he's neoliberal enough to work with, say, Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg or whoever might end up getting the nomination in a brokered convention. So Inslee is well positioned to work in pretty much any Democratic administration. It's an outside possibility that he could end up as a VP pick if there's some kind of an ecological crisis and the eventual nominee is someone who doesn't have a very strong record on environmental issues. It's also possible if the nominee is someone who is a person of color or a woman that they might try to pick Inslee as a balance for the ticket. I assume that a lot of the people who advised Hillary Clinton to choose Tim Kaine for these reasons will be around, and if an establishment candidate is in fact nominated, that person will then receive very similar advice to what Hillary got back in 2016. So I would not be stunned if in a brokered convention scenario where, say, like Cory Booker wins a nomination, that he then announces Jay Inslee as his VP. But outside of that scenario, if, say, Biden or Bernie wins the nomination and then wins the White House, I could very easily see Jay Inslee being tapped to head the EPA. I think that would be his first choice. Or the Department of Energy, that's something that he's familiar with. Or the Department of the Interior, something else that he's relatively familiar with. Any of those things seem very likely, regardless of who the Democrats nominate, assuming that person actually wins the election. So don't be surprised if you hear more about Jay Inslee as speculation mounts about potential cabinet picks for whoever the Democrats nominate over the summer of 2020.